Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. This is a webinar for athletes and for anyone else in the anti-doping community. And our topic today is anti-doping testing in 2021, with a special focus on the Olympics, the Paralympics, and also looking at how COVID-19 is changing things in anti-doping and what some of the future of testing might look like. So thank you very much for joining us. I have myself, I'm Ben Sanford, the chair of the wider athlete committee, and I have three wonderful people from the anti-doping world joining me today for this webinar. So welcome George Chamas from WADA, who's the senior manager of testing, Francesca Rossi, who is the director of testing for the French anti-doping organization, and also James Schlatter, who is the IPC anti-doping director. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today. And what I'll first do is go through some housekeeping, and then we'll get right into the webinar. So for the housekeeping today, the webinar will be recorded, and there will be a recording sent out to you afterwards. Just a quick note on WADA's privacy policy. We will not use any personal information for any direct marketing or unsolicited follow-up unless you have first been informed of this, and we will also not share any of your personal information with any third parties. There will be a survey that will go out to you after the webinar, so please have a look at that and please fill that in. And also the format for the webinar is that the four of us will go through our various topics, and then there'll be a Q&A afterwards where we'll endeavour to answer all your questions. But please, there is a question box in your GoToWebinar tab on the side of your screen. So please enter any questions that you have there, and I'll be monitoring them through the webinar, and then once we get to the Q&A at the end, I can ask our speakers the most difficult questions that you ask. So please make sure that they're difficult and challenging for our speakers. So again, thank you for joining us. This is one of our athlete series webinars, and we've done a number of these, and this is, I guess, since we're talking about COVID, this is one of the outcomes of being in a pandemic world, is that we've started doing webinars, and we've been running these for the last 2 years now. And had a various, range of topics. But, being a COVID world, COVID is, being one of the ones that athletes have wanted to hear from us on the most, and how COVID has affected anti-doping. Has it affected the field of play? Especially in a year, like 2021, where we've had the Olympics and Paralympics. These are a major events which athletes train their lives for. So there's been a lot of interest from athletes to hear from the experts in the field about what has happened, what testing has taken place, and so you're really happy to have the speakers today, so we can talk about what is happening and hopefully reassure everyone that things are pretty good out there, and that everyone's doing their best, and we're getting there. So without further ado, I'll hand over to, we're first going to start off with George, who's going to give us an overview of testing in the pandemic. So George, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and it's a pleasure to be among you. I'll switch off my camera and I will crack on. So with my presentation, I will give an overview of the global testing figures since 2019. I will highlight the various guidance documents that WADA published since the COVID-19 pandemic started, and then I will provide an overview of other activities during this pandemic, which aimed at maintaining the confidence in the anti-doping system and that athletes are competing in a doping-free environment. Next slide, please. So the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously had a significant impact on the testing activities globally in 2020 and in 2021, like any other activity in our lives. In this slide, you can see the overall samples collected in 2019. These are the green columns. 2020 are the black columns. And the first 3 quarters of 2021 are the blue columns. Now, I would like to say here that the 2020 and 2021 figures are not final yet. But yes, we do see a reduction in 2020. So you can see the curve in the black columns. And while the sample numbers were considerably down in the early months of the pandemic, so especially around March to June 2020, after that we saw testing increasing steadily. And we can note in the latest figures that the numbers of samples collected by anti-doping organizations around the world is quickly sort of returning to normal despite the ongoing pandemic. Also, the latest preliminary figures in 2021 show a peak in June, which is right before the Tokyo Games. That's when we had the highest number of samples collected since the pandemic started in March 2020. And it's also a month that surpassed any other month in 2019. Next slide, please. So with this slide here, we present the out-of-competition samples collected in that period. And we note that out-of-competition testing during January to September 2021 versus the same period in 2019 is actually increased by 9%. In fact, from March to July 2021, you can see the blue columns, the number of out-of-competition samples was above the same months in 2019. And these examples indicate that anti-doping organizations did their best to re-establish sample collection programs leading into the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Tokyo. Despite the restrictions that are still in place throughout parts of the world, out-of-competition testing is now at a similar, if not greater level than the same period in 2019. And we attribute the return to normal levels of out-of-competition testing, to the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination programs globally, but also the hard work and dedication and commitment of all the anti-doping organizations that they have showed throughout the pandemic. This is my final slide of figures. With this one, we present the in-competition samples collected in that period. And of course, the limited number of sporting competitions that took place in 2020, which normally make up around 45 to 50% of total sample numbers, had a considerable impact on the number of in-competition samples collected in 2020. And this remains the case in 2021, as the number of events taking place is still comparatively low. Just to give you one more figure, the number of samples collected in competition for the period January to September 2021 is at 66% in compared to the same period in 2019. However, the good news is that in the month of September 2021, the preliminary figures show that this is the largest number of samples collected in competition since the pandemic started. WADA issued updated guidance for anti-doping organizations in light of the pandemic for the first time on the 20th of March 2020. This was a health-focused guidance, which was developed in collaboration with ADOs and the World Health Organization for all sample collection procedures. Back then, we had border closures, mandatory quarantines or isolations, social movement restrictions, office closures and cancellation of events, as we said. So all this hindered the normal day-to-day work of all those involved in anti-doping. And the purpose was to determine how the anti-doping community could best operate in this very challenging environment. The guidance followed globally recommended health and hygiene procedures and was in line, of course, with the international standard for testing and investigations. It covered a number of areas that were affected by COVID, such as the provision of whereabouts information, sample collection and transportation to laboratories, sample analysis, results management and investigations, TUE exemptions, therapeutic use exemptions, and of course other activities that are covered by the World Anti-Doping Program. There were two further updates, one in May and one in November 2020 of this guidance. These updates were focusing on the evolving nature of the pandemic and the fact that some parts of the world that had initially suspended or significantly reduced testing were getting back to normal as restrictions began to be lifted. Now, I'm pleased to say here that we're currently working on another revised version. Hopefully, it will be published before the end of the year. That will provide further guidance on vaccination of sample collection personnel based on what the anti-doping community had learned and following the introduction of a global vaccine program. WADA developed also another resource in order to address some specific concerns raised by athletes. It published a question and answer document that was developed in consultation with its athlete committee and that followed on from the guidance to ADOs. And this document covered issues such as ongoing testing, minimizing the risk of contracting or transmitting the virus, of course, filing of whereabouts, validating TUEs, refusing to comply with testing, and maintaining confidence in the anti-doping system. This document was adopted over time and was updated twice, in May 2020 and in February 2021, again in consultation with WADA's athlete committee, and it can be found on WADA's website. We will continue to be updating this document in order to provide the latest information to athletes on how testing programs may evolve, in order, of course, to protect both clean sport and the health of athletes and sample collection personnel involved. Finally, and with regards to other activities during this period, we saw some initiative from a number of ADOs where they planned or even implemented alternative sample collection procedures. This included the use of tablets and a virtual connection with the testers, the doping control officers, a visual inspection of the toilet before and after the provision of a sample, temperature control of the sample, and other alternative measures that were piloted. This is one of the main topics that the newly established STEAG is working on. This expert group is conducting a feasibility study into the use of alternative sample collection programs, and the objective of the study are to determine whether these procedures could be put in place to address limitations faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Its aim is also to provide a harmonized approach to these alternative/modified sample collection procedures in a form of guidance that could be utilized during exceptional circumstances. I believe we will discuss this further with Ben later on. With regards to the Tokyo Games, WADA supported the work of the pre-games testing group, which was coordinated by the International Testing Agency, the ITA, on behalf of the IOC, and which aimed to ensure that all athletes competing at the Olympic Games have been subject to a suitable level of testing in the lead-up to the Games. WADA also supported the implementation of the long-term sample storage program, which was funded by the IOC, where anti-doping organizations could have samples collected from athletes prior to the Games stored for up to 10 years at no cost for a possible further analysis in the future. To finish, WADA had also independent observer teams present in Tokyo to monitor the anti-doping activities at both the Olympic and the Paralympic Games, and work in partnership with the IOC, the ITA, the IPC, and the organizing committee to ensure the most effective anti-doping program is delivered. I believe Francesca will elaborate a bit more on the pre-games testing group and the IO mission in Tokyo. So this concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you very much. Over to Francesca.
Yes, hello to everyone. Before switching off the camera, I want just to say hello to you. And yes, my mission in FLD started in January 2020, and just before the pandemics. And it was really the right moment to start a new mission with new people in a new country. So everyone was stressed, I was stressed, but as I showed you, everything went quite well. So now I want to just say to you that these are the topics we are going to share with you today. Of course, we cannot talk of testing in 2021 if we do not come back on what happened in 2020 in a more practical way. And now the adults try to face with the COVID-19 pandemics and the related restrictions, because several decisions taken in 2020 had also an impact in the testing strategies of all adults in 2021. And this is why it's worthy to have a look what's happened. I will then show you some details about the testing program before and during the games, especially related to who was doing what and when, in order to guarantee unfair and balanced testing program for all athletes competing in the games, as George already touched upon before. And in the end, we will talk with some considerations and we share comments, etc. So next, please. It is important that you understand that in 2020, all adults try to do their best to avoid any breaking in testing activities, even though sometimes this was not possible due to the dramatic national situations in some countries. In France, we were relatively lucky. We were able to limit the lack of testing to only 3 weeks. And during these 3 weeks, we prepared a protocol. We used the protocol before WADA, but likely it was really compliant with what WADA asked after. We needed to understand how many of our 150 DCOs were still available and not busy in hospitals. We needed time to buy the material needed. As you remember, maybe there were lack of masks, lack of gloves. So we tried to have this material available. And the athletes were locked down as anyone else. So the difficult decision who was worthy to be tested has to be taken. So we limited the testing to the top target and the athletes that still have some hopes to come back to competition. Remember that at the beginning, we didn't know that the Olympic Games will be postponed, so we still had the hope that that was going on. So we tried to test these athletes that were going to Olympics, especially auto competition. As soon as the games were reported, our attention went to team sports that were still in the hopes to go back to compete before the end of the year. And this was what happened in 2020 in my country. So as you can imagine, stress for you, stress for us, but we never gave up. It's true that we ended the year with less tests, 6,500 instead of 8,000 as we previewed. But it's true also that we had, for the first time, a crazy ratio on auto competition compared to in competition. We had also less adverse analytical findings. We had less TUEs, so less of everything. But in the end, that is in line with what George showed you. The final result was different, but it was interesting also because allowed us to have a different scenario at the end of the year. Next, please. And what about the other organizations? I can provide you with a superficial overview because we have regular virtual meetings with our colleagues and we talk regularly. We were locked down all over the world and we try to find reasonable solutions and support each other because we are in the end committed people and we understood very well the danger behind the decreasing of testing activity. But this went together, the decrease of all sports activities. And as George showed, what we observed in France is valid everywhere. We had more auto competition tests than usual, less tests, but more auto competition were conducted following the classical procedure, but not only. So we try to find original alternatives, and sometimes some things were proposed, implemented, and with success. The most successful alternative I can share with you is the use, for instance, of camping cars in some countries that allowed to continue the testing. The virtual testing that George said before were implemented in some opportunities, and other countries that were strictly locked down were allowed only to test in training centers. But we never give up. The most difficult time was also for international federations, because NADOS can manage what is happening in the country, but the IFEs, they don't have the possibility to manage what's happening in all countries. So what's happened to NADOS? We had more job to do on behalf of IFEs because the borders were closed, and in that case, we worked more on behalf of them. Next, please. And now let's have a look at 2021. I highlighted in red what, in my view, could be considered a guarantee to implement a robust and fair testing program before and during Olympics. From half of 2020, beginning on 2021, activities increased progressively, respecting always the COVID protocol. We never stopped. Even if we were not 100% sure about the maintaining of the games, we acted as we were sure in order to guarantee a good program, and especially on athletes that were going to compete in Japan. For this reason, each organization performed the annual risk assessment and testing distribution planning, taking into account the games. For your information, risk assessment and testing distribution planning are posted in ADAMS. So WADA can monitoring what is going on. And this is a guarantee that all organizations are doing a fair job. The International Testing Agency, delegated by the IOC to manage the anti-doping program in Olympics, plays a major role in coordinating some activities before the Games. 25,000 of testing recommendations were issued at the beginning of 2021 by the expert group that George named before. These recommendations were based on the ranking of athletes going to compete in the Games. And all others tried to comply to these recommendations, sharing the activities. For instance, if an athlete had not enough tests in 2020, the expert group recommended to perform 5 tests before Olympics, so the NADOS and the IFEs were obliged to coordinate their activities in order to share the job and to be sure that at the end, the athlete had enough tests before going to Olympics. 3 months before the Games, the International Testing Agency took the leadership if the organization could not achieve their goals, and to try to fill these gaps and continue to do, keeping an eye on whereabouts when athletes were flying to Japan. So this means that it was really a common effort of all the anti-doping community to try to guarantee that the athletes going to Olympics were enough tested before going to compete. Next one. As said, during the Games, ITA, the International Testing Agency, was responsible to run the in-competition and out-of-competition testing program. ITA drafted a risk assessment and TDP that was specific for the Games, taking into account, among other parameters, all pre-Games activity. For reassure you, the risk assessment and the testing distribution planning were shared with WADA before the Games. And during the Games, the testing distribution plan was constantly updated, taking into account the performances, the competition results, and another important element which impacted the testing distribution plan during the Games was the recommendations and intelligence that were shared from ADOS and the PMUs during the Games. So it means that this testing distribution planning were dynamic, and all these recommendations were implemented. Next one, please. In order to guarantee that the anti-doping program during the Games was fair and robust, WADA, as George anticipated, established a team of people selected among ADOS and WADA on staff with the role of observe if everything was going well and respect what has been planned before the games. The independent observer team, which I lead, visited more or less 90% of the anti-doping stations in the Olympics venues. George was with me during this adventure, but George and I had a daily meeting with ITA, and during these meetings, ITA reported to us how the program was going on, issues, successes, and also we shared every day with ITA observations to improve the program in real time. And this, the result of this exercise will be published in the next week, and there is a report coming out, and you can see and be reassured that everything went well. In the end, I know that I provided you with plenty of information, and I hope that what I said helped you in understanding how much we care of you. In any case, any suggestion for future improvements are more than welcome. But before everything, you have to trust the anti-doping organization, because working for you is a job, but working with you is a pleasure. And the majority of the anti-doping community people wants to work with you and not only for you. So working for you is our institutional role, but working with you and being a team will make the difference for the future. So thanks you for your attention. Now, I think it's James that has to take the lead.
Thank you, Francesca. So I think what we've heard from Francesca, and I'll turn my camera off as well for now. What we heard from Francesca and George, we will see happen exactly the same in the Paralympic world as well. And so during COVID-19, there was never any time when testing had completely stopped in Paralympic sport. But from the IPC side, there was a little bit less than 3 months where our service providers were not able to collect samples. And what we see here, we're looking at testing numbers for para-athletics, para-swimming, and para-powerlifting. Para-powerlifting is difficult to say, so I will just continue to call them athletics, swimming, and powerlifting. So what we saw in 2020 was a drastic decrease in mostly in competition testing. Out of competition testing, we had a slight decrease. This was seen in the IPC testing program as well as in the worldwide testing program. But as George mentioned, in 2021, we had a big rebound in testing in the lead up to the Paralympic Games. What I would mention is that in 2020, with kind of all of the uncertainty that went along with would competitions happen, would they not, it also made it difficult to adequately plan testing, because a lot of our testing strategies revolve around planning testing outside of around competitions, so that we can ensure that those competitions are clean. So we can move to the next slide, please. So what were the preparations for the Paralympics that the IPC made? Well, there was an increased awareness of anti-doping issues in Paralympic sport, and this was not something that just started since I started at the IPC in 2018. It has been something that we have been very much trying to make other anti-doping organizations aware that there is a testing gap in between Olympic and Paralympic sport, and we would like that closed. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The IPC provided more testing resources for athletes, NATOs, and international federations. We had a dedicated webpage of information for athletes and NATOs surrounding Tokyo 2020. We published our first ever testing guide for testing athletes with a disability. That was a long time coming and took a long time to produce, and we're really excited about that. We partnered with WADA to produce the Adele education program for the Paralympic Games. There was an Olympic version of that as well, and we assisted them to Paralympicize the education program. We provided NATOs with testing recommendations. Unfortunately, they weren't as many as the ITA did. Their 25,000 make our 500 look small, but these were the athletes that in the lead up to the Paralympics had been under tested. So we weren't sending recommendations for athletes who were being adequately tested by NATOs. And this was only in the 3 sports. And I'm listing these 3 sports because they are sports that the IPC manages the year-round testing program for. And so it's easier to work on their to go through their stats, and so it's they're also 3 of the highest risk sports in the Summer Games. The IPC also ensured that the athletes within our registered testing pool were properly tested heading into Tokyo, and we used IPC competitions to fill any testing gaps that we may have seen, and we use a sophisticated risk assessment tool to determine testing selections at competitions. Next slide, please. So what were the outcomes? Well, we saw a massive increase in NATO testing in 2021, the likes we've never really seen before. The biggest spike was after the Olympics had begun and the NATOs moved away from concentrating their testing on their Olympic athletes to the Paralympic athletes. So I'll discuss some of the things that we need to work on, but I think that's probably one of them, is to even out the testing a little bit more. The Adele course, the Paralympic Adele course, was taken more than 2,000 times, which is excellent. What we saw in terms of anti-doping rule violations in the pre-competition testing was pretty much what we expected, but what we did not expect was that the number of anti-doping rule violations during the Paralympic Games were lower than expected. So with the increased testing, we saw an increase in anti-doping rule violations leading into the Games. There were quite a few that were caught in the 1 to 2 months prior to the Games. So we're hoping that the cause for the lower number of anti-doping rule violations during the Games was because the testing had improved prior to the Games. One thing that I will say, when we look at the stats, we see that between 2016, prior to the Rio Paralympics, and then in the year of 2021 during the Tokyo Paralympics, we had a massive increase in testing in Paralympic sport, and this is really great. But there was a lot of room for improvement. So in 2016, Olympic athletes were 5 times more likely to be tested than Paralympic athletes. So what we're seeing is that gap decreasing, and we are going to work with anti-doping organizations to ensure that continues, because we see that there is a doping risk in Paralympic sport, the same as in Olympic sport. So what were the lessons that we will take going forward into Beijing, but particularly into Paris 2024? Well, we're going to learn from the IOC and ITA pre-Games task force and see where we can use some of the strategies that they used on a kind of a smaller scale, but something that is more comprehensive than what we had done prior to Tokyo. We're going to increase the uptake of our education resources by improving promotion and increasing the number of languages available. And for us, lacking, let's say, Arabic was probably problematic for us, and it's something that we need to improve on. And as I mentioned, we want to continue to close the testing gap between Olympic and Paralympic athletes. And that's the end of my section. Ben?
Thank you very much, James. Hello again, everyone. So I am going to take you through the next part of the webinar, and our speakers so far have been super quick, so we're running ahead of schedule, so thank you, guys. The next part is I wanted to discuss, we have COVID-19, we have the pandemic, and so how can we learn from this? How can we improve, and how can we prepare moving forward to make sure that we're prepared if this ever happens again, and what improvements can we try to make to anti-doping, and in particular to sample collection. And you've heard from George, Francesca, and James around the testing programs and how anti-doping was able to hold up during the pandemic, and what different organizations did to ensure that testing continued, and to ensure that we had clean sport. But I wanted to sort of change focus a little bit and focus on some of the things that we're doing now to look into the future, and to be prepared. So as we've been talking about, COVID-19, there was an impact on testing. This was obviously a first for everyone, and it's still a first. We're still going through this. We have the worldwide rollout of vaccines, and government, sports organizations, and anti-doping organizations are we're all learning as we go, and improving. Personally, I think anti-doping's actually done a really good job of responding to the pandemic, and putting systems and procedures in place to make sure that we still have clean sport. So one of the things that happened, and Francesca touched on this, was anti-doping organizations responded to the pandemic, and a few of them set up alternative sample collection procedures. So as mentioned, there was the Campervan Trials. So a few anti-doping organizations essentially had campervans that they went around to an athlete's residence, and the athlete would come out and go into the campervan, into a separate part of the campervan, basically, which was designed for anti-doping controls. And so that was so that the doping control officer didn't have to go into the athlete house, because there was a lot of concern about, if the doping control officer, did have COVID, you don't want to be then infecting athletes, and vice versa as well. So how do you protect everyone, and continue to run your sample collection? So there was the campervans. There were also there was virtual testing. So there was the US ran a program of completely virtual, where they actually posted out the doping control kits to athletes, and then they would call them in the designated hour and say, today is your doping control, and they would, using video technology, they would communicate to the athlete and take them through the procedure. Others were partly virtual, so a DCO would turn up on an athlete's doorstep, hand them the kit, and then the DCO would maybe communicate to them outside from a tablet outside, so again via video communication, but not actually in the house with the athlete. And then there was also the other version of that, where there was essentially a central location where the package would be dropped off by one DCO, and another DCO at another location would then communicate with the athlete. And then there was testing at training centres. So, instead of going in and out of a training centre, the doping control officers actually stayed at the training centre, and tested the athletes as they needed to there. So different organizations, tried to keep testing going in different ways. And so when we look at all these alternative sample collection procedures, part of WADA's role as the world regulator for anti-doping is to see, to assess them basically, and to see what works, what doesn't work, what we think we could recommend moving forward. And so to do this, WADA set up the Strategic Testing Expert Advisory Group, which is quite a long name, so I'm going to refer to it as the STIG from now on. Salva, next slide, please. So the working group STIG, as I've said, it's to review what has actually happened out in the real world in alternative sample collection. There's really tight guidelines for how sample collection can happen, and those guidelines are there for very, very good reasons. They're there to ensure the integrity of the sample, the integrity of the process. They're there to ensure that athletes' rights are respected, to ensure that there's as few ways as possible that the test can be manipulated in any way, and to make sure that we all have faith in the system. So that the rules are good, but in a pandemic, when we can't actually physically go into someone's house, things have had to change. So the working group is looking at what's happened and coming up with a number of recommendations that they are working through currently that might be able to be adopted in the future if we ever find ourselves in extraordinary circumstances. And those extraordinary circumstances are such as the pandemic, where there are public health measures in place which actually prevent us from the normal business and the normal way of doing things. As we look at all these alternative sample collection processes and what the future might hold, like one of the main things here is that we are looking at doing this for extraordinary circumstances. So it's not just your normal standard sample collection, and the other part of it is that whatever's recommended, it must maintain the integrity of the sample and the process. So that's paramount. You can't have a process which is going to potentially impact on the integrity of the sample, because that's paramount for athletes and also for anti-doping. So there's two broad categories that the working group is looking at, and there's I describe them as virtual, so completely virtual. So that's where the athlete receives the equipment remotely, and then they're called by an anti-doping organization. They through video call technology, the DCO who's not on site is at another site, takes them through the process, and then the samples are sent back to the anti-doping organization. And then the other one, which was more widely used, is the DCO on site, so partly virtual. So that's where the DCO turns up on the athlete's doorstep, hands them the kit. So there's no advance notice. They hand them the kit. The athlete goes through the process. The DCO is outside, on a video call with the athlete, walking them through the steps to make sure that they go through the sample collection process correctly. And then once that's all done, then the athlete puts the finished sample outside, and the DCO takes it and takes it back to the anti-doping organization. So those are two of the broadly speaking what we're talking about when we're looking at alternative sample collection and the way forward. But obviously there's a lot of athlete considerations. If we're going to be changing or making any recommendations for how sample collection might happen during a pandemic or in other extraordinary circumstances, we really need to look at does this work from an athlete perspective, and what are the athlete considerations here. So I'm really interested to hear from any of the athletes that are on the call today, through the question and answers, or even after the webinar. Please reach out to us or to me, because we do need to hear from you. And the wider athlete committee does a lot of work and thinking about how these things are going to impact on athletes and what athlete concerns will be. But the more we hear from athletes, the better. So if we are going to be making recommendations, like we need to make sure that it's a fair system and that it's applied equally. And so one of the biggest issues that athletes have faced and that we get asked all the time is, it's all very well that I'm getting tested 5 times a year and I'm doing all my whereabouts, but what about the athlete that I'm competing against from the other side of the world? Are they having to follow the same rules? So we need to make sure that as best as possible these recommendations can be applied equally around the world. We also need to minimize the burden on the athlete. And by that I really mean, if we're asking the athlete to basically be the DCO and do their own sample collection, that's making it a lot more complicated for the athlete, and there's a lot more risk involved there. Like one of the things at the moment is that you'll have the DCO and in the same room with you. They will actually be responsible for most of the process. They will take you through it step by step, and they're right there helping you, explaining things to you, and that's very different when they're not there, when they're just online communicating with you via video. The athlete has to then not just give the sample, but also make sure that the bottle tops are screwed on properly, that the forms are filled in correctly, that specific gravity is taken, what happens when there's partial samples, what happens if you fall over and you knock some of the sample over. So there's all sorts of things that need to be considered to make sure that athletes and their rights are protected in the system. So we would, if we are making recommendations, we need to be aware that, if there isn't going to be a DCO there, then we're essentially asking athletes to do what we're getting professionals, or at least professional volunteers, to do at the moment. And we need to make sure that when we're doing this, we're communicating to athletes in their language, and making this process as simple as possible for them, because we don't want to burden athletes with even more responsibilities if we don't need to. So need to minimize what athletes need to do to make this work, and we don't want to be setting up athletes to fail. So we don't want to be making this process so complicated and difficult that athletes are inadvertently making mistakes and then being charged for making those mistakes. Next slide, please, Salva. And one of the big things about anti-doping is that we need athletes to have faith in it. We need to be able to demonstrate that it works, and athletes have a pretty good understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of situations in the past where athletes have gone to quite extreme measures to undermine the sample collection process. Whether it's trying to taint the urine as it goes into the bottles, whether it's smashing the bottles. So there's been some very, whether it's wearing fake appendages, there's all sorts of things that have been tried in the past. And so like any recommendations in the space, like they need to be robust, they need to be easy for the athletes, but athletes also have to have faith in them to know that, they are there and they are exceptionally difficult for athletes, to corrupt in any way, because, as a clean athlete, you want to know that the process is strong enough that it's not easy for other athletes that, have ulterior motives to dope. You want to make sure that the process is also catching them. So one of the things that we've often spoken about in this space is, obviously we're talking about if there's an online video interaction between the athlete and the DCO. And so should the sample collection process be recorded, or should it just be streamed between the athlete and the DCO? And this gets really complicated when you're talking about the actual sample collection as well. You know, for me, that raises all sorts of concerns around privacy if there's a recording of an athlete actually giving the sample, but then how is the DCO able to witness the giving of the sample? So, you know, those are the sorts of things that we need to consider, and, you know, interested to hear from other athletes out there if, you know, the recording of a sample collection is, you know, a bridge too far, but if, you know, the streaming of that, so there would be no recording, so the DCO would essentially be the same as what currently happens, but instead of having the DCO there, they would be witnessing via a video stream. The other point here is on DNA, and so one of the things that we saw in some of the alternative sample collection processes was the need for the anti-doping organisation to verify that the athlete was actually who they said they were, because the DCO wasn't actually there. So to do that, DNA analysis was required, and there's, you know, additional requirements around you know, what is needed for DNA and that type of analysis. And then the other part here is, you know, if we're asking the athlete, if we're sending the equipment to the athlete instead of just turning up on their doorstep, you know, athletes are busy, they travel a lot, they've got competitions to go to. So, you know, is that complicating the life for an athlete if, you know, suddenly they're having to move, you know, go to a training center? Are they having to take this equipment with them, or is this equipment only meant to be staying in their house? So there's a lot of considerations for athletes in this space, but the work of the working group, you know, continues, and, you know, we're slowly working through the process to make sure that, you know, whatever recommendations that we make are robust. And both George and James and myself are on that working group. So, you know, please give us any information or feedback, or athletes out there, if you have any concerns, like, please get in contact with us, because, you know, we'd love to hear from you and, you know, run through some of the recommendations, or possible recommendations, I should say. And I think, Salva, that's me done. We can get everyone back on camera. Stop hiding, everyone. Welcome back.
Hello.
George, James, did you have anything? So now's the Q&A, everyone. So I have some questions, but if anyone else has questions, like, please put them into the questions tab on your sidebar, and we'll do our best to work through and answer them. George, James, Francesca, did you have any questions or anything you wanted to add on the alternative sample collection and the work that's happening there?
Ben, I think your summary was fantastic. I will start with that. I think what I wanted to add is that for the ADOs that use these alternative sample collection methods, there was in advance communication to athletes, so they were aware of a possible change that is going to happen due to the pandemic, and I think that helped a lot. And I also believe that these ADOs had quite positive feedback from these procedures. So this is why the STEAG, and I'm with you, it's really hard to pronounce this this group. So I called it myself as well during my presentation, STEAG. The STEAG is definitely looking into it, and is working on what is possible within guidelines, so that it can be harmonized across the globe. Thank you.
And just from the Paralympic side as well, obviously that then becomes even testing, which maybe let's say maybe a little bit more complicated for some athletes, becomes extremely complicated if we're doing it remotely. So we're also looking at ways in which we can look at how to test Paralympic athletes and athletes that require modifications in the testing procedures.
Thanks. Okay, moving into just some general questions. From my side, it's been interesting over the last, 2 years, with the pandemic. The questions that we've been getting from athletes have really changed during the course of the pandemic. But the first one that I wanted to sort of ask generally is, there was a reduction in testing. Did you see, or were you aware of, an increase in doping as a result of the pandemic? Like, that was the biggest fear from athletes at that time, was that if we reduce testing, athletes are going to go away and dope. Like, did any of you see that or
No,
that?
I replied to you for what is our experience was almost the contrary. So in the sense that when athletes realized that the sport was dead, so in the sense that the doping it preview a program, and the program has a goal. If you lose the goal, some doping programs doesn't make any sense. So that was what was reported to us, and this was also we were also able to observe this because we increased the outdoor competition testing. So we were present almost everywhere, every time, because our athletes were easy to be located, because they were locked down, they could not move, they cannot leave the country. So that was difficult also for them. And the positive side for us during the pandemic was that we changed a little the athlete population that we tested. Like we dedicated more resources to team sports that were not tested at another time, because they were the only one having something in front of them, because team sports were the first to be reactivated. So I can say that no, for me it was not. We didn't have any result in having more cases or more doping programs, and statistics. We will see when WADA will release the ADRV statistics when it will be ready. That this is what we observed here. So athletes were locked down, difficult to implement doping programs, and loss of interest. So 2021 was more dangerous in this sense because the Olympics were coming, but we increased the test. So
Yeah, I think those are really good points, because I don't think, and definitely what I was aware of, through the anti-doping community, was that just because we weren't testing, it didn't mean that other things weren't happening in the anti-doping space. So it allowed more education. Investigations were still able to continue, and and there was no sport either. So there wasn't, from an athlete point of view, like we saw a lot of athletes really struggling with the pandemic and the uncertainty, because suddenly the competition that you've been training for your life, for the last few years, you don't know if it's happening, then it's being moved, and so there's absolutely no point in for doping for something that you don't know when it's going to be. So that's James, George, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
And also, sorry, I will just add that also in intelligence information coming in general, we had some amount coming. Everything was frozen. So really, it was like if athletes were not active. But now it's normal, we say. So that everything came back. So that's good.
Yeah, everything's getting there, isn't it? It's slowly getting back to normal in most places. James, was that your
I think
same experience?
From our side, what we saw was kind of the normal but delayed results of a Paralympic game. So the same goes typically for the Olympics as well, is that in the lead up to the Olympics or Paralympics, testing increases, the pressure that the athletes are under increases, and we will see an increase in anti-doping rule violations, and that's pretty much what we saw, but no different than what we've seen in, prior to the Rio. So it's pretty much exactly what we had expected. And then in Tokyo, from our side, I think from the Olympic side as well, the number of cases was relatively low. So so hopefully that means that the system worked, because we did see the normal spike in cases prior to the games, but we didn't see the kind of the normal level that we see of anti-doping rule violations at the games themselves. So that's probably a good thing.
And if this can reassure the analyst population, really, we talked a lot among organizations in order to coordinate the testing efforts, because we were all in the same conditions and difficulties, etc. So this increased the collaboration, and the fact that ITA at a certain time delivered the recommendations, and there was a platform where this recommendation needed to be shared. This harmonized the efforts. So the gaps were filled in the end, more than before. So that is a good point, and this is also for the future. We are going in this direction of being in a certain way obliged to communicate, but this will make the difference, because the efforts will be oriented to fill in the gaps when there are gaps to be filled in. Do you believe we reassure them? No.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm assured.
Just one more thing that we did do that was kind of different than in the past was we collected a lot more biological passport blood samples, so specifically for endurance sports, and we definitely did not see an increase in abnormal profiles, of what really at all. Like it's, you always will have a few. Some will be natural and some will be a little bit more suspicious, but the total number, despite the increased tests, did not go up. So that's another pretty good indication.
Yeah, that is. A question about the games, the Olympics and the Paralympics. James, you were there, running anti-doping for the IPC, and George and Francesca, you were there as part of the independent observer team. These were games that were held, during a pandemic. Was there anything, in terms of testing at the games or sample collection at the games that, was different than normal? Or was everything, just normal, as in, it could have been 2016, but, it wasn't?
I go, and George, you can complete.
You go first.
The difference was that for the first time, ITA took the complete leadership of the anti-doping program during the games, and the difference due to the pandemics was that the athletes arrived in Japan the last minutes almost, so they cannot stay long. So the athletes were tested auto competition during all the games. So it means they arrived, they were tested in competition, but the program was more fluid in this sense compared to before, when the athletes arrived a long time before. So auto competition program was delivered before and less during the games. So this was it was due to the fact that they had no choice, because we needed to fill the gaps of athletes that were less tested to the organization, they were not able or they couldn't test. So, but this was the positive side, and I think it was the good side. So, and we discussed a lot with George, and I think he agreed on this. I hope we agreed on this.
Well, listen, you were my boss during the game, so I didn't have an option, did I? No, from my side, what I wanted to say is that the athletes were in a bubble, and we were in a bubble as well. We were constantly getting tested. Athletes were constantly getting tested, so that was different to previous games. Of course, the other huge difference was there were no crowds. But at the same time, the games happened, which was very positive for for the effort of the athletes all these years waiting for these games, and they had the opportunity to win medals and perform exceptionally. So all that was positive. In terms of the procedures, I mean, yes, the normal measures that we have in our daily lives today, still, at least most of us, with social distancing and mask wearing. So it was different, but different in a good way, I would say.
And from your side, James?
Yeah, my office was in the village, so I was going in and out of the village every day during the games, and the village honestly just felt the same. There's always like this special feeling in an Olympic or Paralympic village. It's hard to describe until you've been there, but it definitely felt the same. You know, until George said it, I forgot that we had been tested every single day. It just became normal, and everyone was just used to spitting into a tube and dropping off their Ziploc bag of their samples to the testing station. It changed what testing positive meant. Everyone was more concerned about testing positive for COVID than for anti-doping. They kind of forgot about us a little bit on that side. But yeah, it was the only difference for us came around athletes who had been close contacts. They were in self-isolation, but still competing. So that made things a little bit more complicated than what we've seen in the past games. Luckily for us, what we say is the Olympics are the greatest test event in the world for the Paralympic Games. So they had been through it all, and we were just kind of following along. And able, we didn't have, we learned from the mistakes and learned from the successes. But we also had these giant doping control stations that were set up for the Olympics. And so isolating athletes, even within a doping control station, was easier than what may happen at a, a run-of-the-mill World Cup event or something like that, where, we're always worried about space. So being able to separate people who, had not tested positive for COVID, but may have been in contact with it, and that complicated things a little bit, but not to a great extent. And sometimes getting people to wear their masks was a little bit of an issue, but overall, I think things went surprisingly smoothly at the games.
Thanks. There's a few other questions here, but we're sort of close to the end of our time, and the questions are more technical. So sort of there's one about how does the ITA and WADA and anti-doping organizations work together, but I think Francesca did a really good job of explaining that and showing how the system fills in the gaps. There's another question about can RADOs be copied into their NADO's testing recommendations from a major event organizer. I don't know the answer to that, but I might let that one be answered offline. And there's another one about DCO Central, which we can probably take offline as well and answer directly. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Is there anything that the three of you would like to say as a final word or anything? No.
Not
Just
really.
good.
thank you.
We
Just
say
a
so
thank you.
many things. Just thank you for staying here and
Yeah,
listen us.
thank you, Ben, for inviting us. It is a pleasure to discuss our experiences, and I think Francesca's messages around the work we do are really important.
Yeah. Thanks,
Yeah,
George.
and like a massive thanks to the three of you. Yeah, your input and your expertise and just the entire work that you've done throughout this pandemic has been enormous. So on behalf of athletes, thank you for all the work that you do day to day. But also a very special thanks for taking part in this webinar. And I think we've given athletes some reassurance and other people that are watching this webinar that the system is robust, that we were dealing with something for the first time, but anti-doping organisations actually did a really good job of dealing with this for the first time, and we're also looking to the future about how we can always improve things. Yeah, and Francesca, I think I think that is the key, working with you, and definitely from the athlete community, that's what we want as well. Like it's much easier to get clean sport if we're all in the same boat, paddling in the same direction, wanting clean sport. Yeah, so to any anti-doping organisations out there, please involve athletes. Bring them in house and work together with your athletes, because they want clean sport, as much, if not more, than anyone else. So I hope. Thank you to everyone for joining in this webinar today. I hope you found it, fun and informative. And please join us for our next webinar. It hasn't been released yet, but it will be, I believe, at the beginning of December. And I'm hoping it's going to be on contamination. So there's a lot of issues around contaminated supplements and medicine and so on. And so we really want to talk about that and some of the issues that our athletes are having, and maybe some of the solutions as well. So join us in December for that. There will be the survey that will get emailed to you as soon as, or that you'll get as soon as you log out of this webinar. So please fill that in. Your feedback, is welcome. And then if there's any questions from that, we'll do our best to answer those questions offline. But thank you, everyone. Again, thank you to our presenters, and have a great evening, everyone, or day, wherever you are in the world, and stay safe out there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.